On April 18, 1890, Maria Pavlovna was born in St. Petersburg into the Romanov dynasty. She was the daughter of Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, granddaughter of Emperor Alexander II, and a cousin of Nicholas II through her father. At 18, she married Prince Wilhelm of Sweden, Duke of Södermanland. They had a son, Leonard, but the marriage ended in March 1914. Then, the First World War changed everything. Maria became a nurse, and in 1917, the Russian Revolution destroyed the world in which she had been raised. She left Russia with her second husband, Prince Sergei Putyutin. Their journey carried them through Moldavia, Romania, and London before they reached Paris. The title remained. The old life did not. In exile, Maria could no longer depend on the imperial world that had once surrounded her. She had lost her homeland and her former position, and she now faced a question that members of her family had rarely needed to answer. How do you build a life when the life you were born for no longer exists? In 1922, Maria created Kitmir, an embroidery workshop employing Russian émigré women. Through her brother Dmitri Pavlovich, she had met Gabrielle Coco Chanel in the autumn of 1921. Their connection eventually brought Kitmir into Chanel's fashion world. A former Grand Duchess was now working through fashion and craftsmanship. But the success was temporary. By 1926, Kitmir was declining. In 1928, Maria sold the workshop to Maison Hurel. On December 8, 1928, she sailed from Le Havre to the United States. She had already crossed one continent to escape the collapse of an empire. Now she was crossing the Atlantic to find out whether she could survive without it. And what happened next would prove that Maria Pavlovna's story was not simply about losing everything. It was about discovering what remained when everything familiar was gone. Maria Pavlovna's fall did not begin in 1917. By then, the world around her had already become unstable, and her own life had begun moving away from the future expected of a Romanov Grand Duchess. In 1908, when Maria was only 18, she married Prince Wilhelm of Sweden, Duke of Södermanland. The marriage connected her to another European royal family, but did not give her the secure personal life that her position might have suggested. A son, Leonard, was born to the couple, yet the marriage was unhappy. By March 1914, the marriage had ended. And then, only months later, Europe entered the First World War. Maria's life changed again. Instead of remaining simply a member of the imperial aristocracy, she worked as a medical nurse during the war. The transformation was significant. A woman born into the Romanov dynasty was now directly involved in the realities of wartime suffering. But the greatest change came in 1917. The Russian Revolution destroyed the political system that had given Maria her extraordinary social position. Her connection to the imperial family could no longer guarantee the future she had known. The old assumptions about wealth, rank, and security disappeared with the collapse of Imperial Russia. Maria left the country with her second husband, Prince Sergei Putyutin. Their route reflected the uncertainty of exile. They passed through Moldavia, Romania, and London, eventually reaching Paris. Maria was no longer living within the protected world of St. Petersburg and the Romanov court. She was an émigré, but exile did not end her story. It forced her to make a decision that would define the next stage of her life, whether to remain attached to the identity she had lost or to use the skills she still possessed to construct something entirely new. In Paris, Maria chose the second path. And in 1922, that decision would lead to the creation of Kitmir, the business that briefly placed a former Romanov Grand Duchess at the center of Parisian fashion. By the autumn of 1921, Maria Pavlovna had already spent years rebuilding her life outside Russia. She was no longer living within the imperial system that had shaped her childhood. Paris had become the setting for a completely different existence, one in which her skills mattered more than her title. Then her brother, Dmitri Pavlovich, introduced her to Gabrielle Coco Chanel. The meeting would have consequences far beyond a social connection. Maria understood embroidery and handicraft. Chanel was building a new language of fashion. Their worlds came together at precisely the moment when Russian émigrés in Paris were searching for ways to survive economically. And then, in 1922, Maria created Kitmir. The workshop employed Russian émigré women and transformed their embroidery skills into commercial work. For Maria, this was not simply an artistic project. It was a way to turn something she could actually do into a source of income. Kitmir soon supplied embroidery for Chanel's collections. The surviving evidence makes this connection unusually clear. A Chanel ensemble from 1922, preserved in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is directly associated with Kitmir. The workshop's surviving embroidery also reveals influences reaching beyond Russia, including traditions associated with the Slavic world, Persia, China, and India. Maria was creating something new from fragments of the world she had lost. There is a striking irony here. The Romanov dynasty had disappeared from power, but one of its grand duchesses was now participating in one of Paris's most influential fashion circles. Kitmir even appeared in advertising published in Vogue in 1926. For a time, Maria's reinvention seemed to be working. But success in fashion could be temporary, and Kitmir's position began to weaken. By 1926, the business was already declining. The very industry that had offered Maria a new identity was changing around her. In 1928, she sold Kitmir to Maison Hurel. The workshop was gone, and Maria had to begin again, once more. This time, she would leave Paris behind and cross the Atlantic, carrying no restored empire with her, only the experience of having already rebuilt her life once before. By 1917, Maria Pavlovna could no longer remain in the country where she had been born. The revolution had destroyed the imperial system that had defined her family's position, and Maria left Russia with her second husband, Prince Sergei Putyutin. There was no return to the life she had known in St. Petersburg. Instead, Maria and Sergei began a journey through several countries. They passed through Moldavia, then Romania, and eventually reached London. From there, they continued to Paris, where Maria would spend the next stage of her life. For you, the important detail is what happened to her identity during this journey. Maria had been born into the Romanov dynasty. Her father was Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich. Her grandfather was Emperor Alexander II. She had once been connected to one of Europe's most powerful royal families. Now she was in exile, but exile did not erase her ability to work. The years surrounding the revolution had already changed Maria in ways that her privileged childhood could never have prepared her for. During the First World War, she had worked as a medical nurse. After leaving Russia, she would have to find another way to support herself. Paris became the place where that transformation began. Maria had practical skills in embroidery and handicraft, and she eventually turned them into something more ambitious. In 1922, she created Kitmir, an embroidery workshop employing Russian émigré women. Her connection with Coco Chanel proved crucial. Maria had met Chanel in the autumn of 1921 through her brother Dmitri Pavlovich. Their relationship eventually brought Kitmir into Chanel's collections. The irony was impossible to miss. A woman who had once belonged to the imperial elite was now building a business with her own hands. And the workshop did more than provide Maria with income. It gave other Russian émigré women a way to work in a foreign country after losing their previous lives as well. But Maria's new independence would soon be tested again. Kitmir could succeed only as long as Parisian fashion wanted its particular kind of embroidery. By 1926, the business was already declining, and in 1928, Maria would have to make another painful decision: sell the enterprise she had built and leave Paris behind. In 1928, Maria Pavlovna sold Kitmir to Maison Hurel. The workshop that had connected her to Parisian fashion was no longer hers. Once again, she had to decide what came next. But Maria did not return to the security of a royal household. She moved to London and attempted another business venture. This time, she entered the world of fragrance, selling her own perfume under the name Prince Igor. The project failed. The problem was not simply that the perfume lacked a market. Maria faced difficulties with advertising and distribution, making it impossible to establish the business successfully. The attempt ended much faster than the period in which she had built Kitmir. Then came another departure. On December 8th, 1928, Maria sailed from Le Havre to the United States. She was leaving Europe behind once again, but this time she was not traveling as a member of an imperial family moving between royal circles. She was trying to start over. In May 1929, only months after arriving in America, Maria began working as a fashion consultant at Bergdorf Goodman, the New York department store. Her role involved selecting fashionable clothing from France. This detail matters. Maria had been born a Grand Duchess. She had married into Swedish royalty at 18. She had lived through revolution, exile, and the collapse of the world that had given her social position. Yet in New York, she was working professionally in fashion. And then, she expanded beyond the department store. Maria later collaborated with the Hearst Corporation, writing material connected with fashion and photography. She was no longer simply trying to preserve her former identity. She was creating a professional one. There was another transformation still ahead. Maria had begun with embroidery. She had moved into fashion consulting. Now she would turn to something even more personal, her own memories. In 1930, her first memoir, The Education of a Princess, was published. 2 years later came A Princess in Exile. The woman who had lost her imperial world was now telling its story in her own words. By the beginning of the 1930s, Maria Pavlovna's life had become almost unrecognizable compared with the world of her childhood. She had once been a Grand Duchess. Now she was earning money through professional work in New York. Her first role was at Bergdorf Goodman. In May 1929, Maria began working there as a fashion consultant, helping select fashionable clothing from France. The contrast was striking. She had not simply escaped the collapse of the Russian Empire. She had entered a completely different professional world. But Maria's transformation did not stop there. She later worked with the Hearst Corporation, contributing material about fashion and photography. Instead of being remembered only as a member of the Romanov family, she was developing a career based on her own abilities. Then came her books. In 1930, Maria published The Education of a Princess. In 1932, she followed it with A Princess in Exile. The books became bestsellers in the United States and Europe and were translated into French and Spanish. Her memories had become part of her livelihood. There was another chapter. In 1935, Hearst sent Maria to Germany as a photojournalist. Her assignments included photographing the lives of passengers aboard luxurious transatlantic liners and documenting high society. Think about the distance she had traveled. A woman born in 1890 as the granddaughter of an emperor had become, by 1935, a working writer and photographer whose professional assignments took her across Europe. And behind Maria stood another group whose experience reflected the same transformation. the Russian émigré women who worked at Kitmir. They too had entered a new economic world after leaving Russia, using embroidery as practical work rather than simply as a symbol of aristocratic culture. But the past never disappeared completely. Maria's books preserved memories of the imperial world that had vanished. Her photography recorded a completely different present. She was living between two identities, the Grand Duchess she had been and the working professional she had become. And then, in 1942, another war would force Maria to leave Europe once again, sending her to Argentina for the most uncertain chapter of her exile. By 1942, Maria Pavlovna had already rebuilt her life more than once. She had left Russia after the revolution, established Kitmir in Paris in 1922, moved to London after selling it in 1928, crossed the Atlantic, worked at Bergdorf Goodman from May 1929, and later became a writer and photographer. But exile was never truly secure. Europe was once again at war. In 1942, Maria moved to Argentina, where she would spend the years of the Second World War. Once again, geography became part of survival. The woman who had already crossed borders after the Russian Revolution now had to live through another global conflict far from the Europe that had shaped her adult life. There is an important difference between Maria's earlier exile and this later one. After 1917, she had been forced to leave a country that no longer offered the world she had known. During the Second World War, Europe itself became increasingly dangerous and unstable. Maria's life had already been defined by displacement, and now another war pushed her farther from a continent. Yet she did not disappear. Her earlier professional transformation mattered. By this stage, Maria was no longer dependent solely on her identity as a Romanov Grand Duchess. She had already worked in fashion, written books, and worked in photography. Those experiences had given her something the collapse of an empire could not take away, a professional identity she had built herself. And then, the war finally passed. In 1949, Maria returned to Europe. The destination was no longer the imperial St. Petersburg of her childhood. The Romanov world was gone, and the political order that had surrounded her family had disappeared decades earlier. Instead, her later years became closely connected with her son Leonard and his family in the area around Lake Constance. The journey from St. Petersburg to Lake Constance had taken almost 6 decades. Maria had crossed countries, careers, marriages, and 2 enormous historical upheavals. She had lived as a Grand Duchess, an émigré, a businesswoman, a fashion consultant, an author, and a photographer. But one final question remained. After spending so much of her life rebuilding herself, where would Maria Pavlovna finally belong? After the Second World War, Maria Pavlovna's life entered its final chapter. In 1949, she returned to Europe after spending the war years in Argentina. But the Europe she came back to was not the Europe she had left. The Russian Empire had disappeared more than 3 decades earlier. The Romanov dynasty was no longer a ruling family. The world of Imperial St. Petersburg existed only in memory. Maria did not attempt to recreate it. Instead, her later years became closely connected with her son, Leonard, and his family near Lake Constance. This was a remarkable destination for a woman whose life had begun in St. Petersburg and carried her through Sweden, wartime Russia, Paris, London, New York, Germany, and Argentina. And then there was the question of memory. Maria had spent decades documenting the world she had lost. Her memoirs, The Education of a Princess and a Princess in Exile, had already transformed personal experience into published history. Her work in photography had also allowed her to observe a changing Europe from the position of someone who had already experienced the collapse of an entire social order. But she was no longer trying to escape. She had finally reached a stage of life where family mattered more than rebuilding another career. Her son Leonard and his family became part of her later life around Lake Constance. The contrast with her childhood could hardly have been greater. The daughter of Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, granddaughter of Emperor Alexander II, and cousin of Nicholas II, was now living quietly with her family far from the imperial world. There is a final irony here. Maria had spent much of her adult life trying to build something after losing what had once seemed permanent. She created Kitmir. She worked in fashion. She wrote books. She became a photographer. She crossed oceans and survived two enormous historical upheavals. Yet her final destination was not another palace. It was family. On December 13th, 1958, Maria Pavlovna died in Constance, West Germany, at the age of 68. The empire she had been born into had vanished decades earlier. But her story did not end with the disappearance of the Romanovs. It ended with a woman who had learned to survive after history took almost everything familiar away. Maria Pavlovna did not live to see the Romanov name restored to power. She died on December 13th, 1958, in Constance, West Germany, at the age of 68. Her final years had been connected with her son Leonard and his family near Lake Constance. By then, almost 7 decades had passed since Maria's birth in 1890. Think about what that meant. Maria had been born when the Russian Empire still shaped her future. She became a Swedish princess by marriage at 18. She became a mother. She worked as a nurse during the First World War. She fled Russia after the Revolution, lived in several European countries, created Kitmir in 1922, worked with Chanel, moved to London, crossed the Atlantic in 1928, and built a professional life in America. Her survival was not based on restoring the past. It was based on adaptation. Her son Leonard became the closest link between Maria's later life and the next generation. Through him, her family continued after her death, even though the imperial system that had defined her childhood had disappeared permanently. And there is another form of survival that matters just as much. Maria left behind written memories. The Education of a Princess, published in 1930, and A Princess in Exile, published in 1932, preserve her personal experience of a vanished world. The books became bestsellers in the United States and Europe, and were translated into French and Spanish. Her legacy therefore survived in 2 different ways. One was through family. The other was through memory. Maria had lost the Russia she knew, but she documented part of that lost world herself. Her story passed beyond the people who had personally known the Romanovs and reached readers who encountered the vanished empire through her experiences. But there was no restoration waiting for her descendants. The Romanov world remained a historical memory. Maria's life had begun inside an empire and ended in exile, but the people who came after her inherited something different. Not a throne, but a story about what happens when history removes the world you thought would last forever. Maria Pavlovna died on December 13th, 1958, in Constance, West Germany, at the age of 68. Her final years have been spent near Lake Constance, close to her son Leonard and his family. There was no return to the Russian Empire. The world Maria had been born into had disappeared decades earlier. The Romanov dynasty no longer ruled Russia, and the imperial position that had defined her childhood could never be restored. But Maria's descendants inherited something more lasting than a title. They inherited a family story shaped by survival. Her son Leonard remained an important connection to the next generation, while Maria's own words preserved her experience for people who would never see the world she remembered. Her memoirs, The education of a princess and a princess in exile allowed readers to encounter that vanished world through the memories of someone who had actually lived inside it. Today, the significance of Maria Pavlovna's story is not simply that she was a Romanov. It is that she discovered how to live after being one. She worked as a nurse. She created Kitmir. She worked in fashion. She wrote books. She became a photographer. She crossed continents and rebuilt her life after losing the world that had once seemed permanent. And then, she reached the end of her life far from the imperial Russia of her birth. Her story leaves you with a difficult question. If your family name, wealth, homeland, and social position disappeared overnight, what part of your identity would remain? Maria's answer was not a throne. It was work, memory, and the ability to begin again. That may be the most important lesson of her life. History can take away the world you inherited, but cannot decide what you become afterward. If you want more stories about the people who survived the collapse of empires, subscribe to the channel. These stories matter because they show history not through dates alone, but through the lives of people forced to rebuild when the old world disappeared. And Maria's story leaves one question worth considering. Would you preserve your former identity or abandon it completely to survive?